Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. And I'm Martin Perkins. I'm Martin Perkins. I'm Martin Perkins. I'm Martin Perkins. So we're resuming talking about Eleanor Roosevelt's approach in this beginning of this part two section because we both think it's very important as a kind of historical reference point. And also a recognition that, we want to say that what's happening in mental health today is cutting edge or it's this or that. But the truth is, there's some really, really important approaches to mental health that have been around for a long, long time. Decades, and in other ways, for centuries and centuries. And what we're trying to really get across here is how important it is for us to turn to wisdom as an approach to what's happening. And Eleanor Roosevelt's approach to mental health was deeply rooted in her own personal experiences with childhood trauma, family struggles with addiction, mental illness, and overcoming what for her was profound emotional hardship. Throughout her life and public career, she evolved into a prominent mental health advocate and author. Her daily newspaper column, My Day, and her book, You Learn by Living, served countless others, but was also a form of self-care for Eleanor. Her way of dealing with the loss of her alcoholic father by suicide and what she called the barrier of fear, and her choice to transform that barrier into a point of interconnection.
That point of interconnection is so important. We've been touching upon it in multiple ways in
Yeah.
part one, and again revisiting it here and giving more context to Eleanor Roosevelt's life feels like a great offering to everyone listening in the sense that she saw it as transformational, as you stated, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that we all experience in different ways. We might not all experience the death of a parent in childhood, but she experienced the death of both of her parents by the age of 10. She was effectively orphaned. And so this facing of early deaths of your caregivers like this, and her brother as well, created that barrier of fear, she called it. And later on in life, she wrote about her childhood and this barrier of fear. And she stated that she was always afraid of something, of displeasing people, of failure. Things that are common for all of us. It's not something that anyone is foreign to feeling.
Right.
Eleanor stated that anything I accomplished had to be done across a barrier of fear.
So Eleanor took that trauma, she took that inner work, and she created a path of action that allowed her to say, okay, I have the inner tools, and now I'm going to advocate for people in the world in all the ways that I know how. And because she was the partner of a politician and a unique partner at that, in the sense that she took on responsibilities as a first lady that were extraordinary, it provided her a certain level of power. Within her My Day column, she frequently highlighted the need for better mental health training, preventive care, and humane treatment for patients within state hospitals, right? In her public speeches, she frequently used that platform to speak at major medical events, such as the International Congress on Mental Health, advocating for public education on mental wellness, and destigmatizing psychiatric care. In her book, You Learn by Living, Roosevelt shares her 11 keys to leading a more fulfilling life. And within the framework of our conversation, we offer that her 11 keys were all very much about what are the active and dynamic things we can do in our lives to continue to be a lifelong learner, learning about the world, but also learning about ourselves. The degree to which she brings holistic care into her book is extraordinary given the time she was living in. Yeah.
It was very intuitive, though, right? And it was the willingness to share so openly in that point
Right.
in time, a
Right.
woman taking that form of leadership, authentic leadership,
Right.
is so potent and so
Yeah.
key that this book comes out in 1960 to speak to that then.
Right.
Not many women have the authority that she does.
Right. Right. And she does it with compassion, with understanding, but also self-knowledge, right? Which is
Yeah.
where a lot of that compassion and understanding comes from. So we'll begin with the first key. Are you going to share the first key?
Yeah. So the first key, as Eleanor Roosevelt puts it, is fear, the great enemy. And she states this through the idea of transforming the fear by facing it and making friends with what we're hearing within us, right?
Right.
And every day we face those moments.
Yeah.
This morning, before we started the podcast, I had to call the transportation services that offer me medical rides
Mm-hmm.
because there was an issue with scheduling my ride to my general physician. Oh, I could feel that fear rising up in me because there was that tension there. Are they going to listen to me? Am I going to be able to advocate for myself? Will that advocacy get through, or will they just stick to their script? Will
Right.
human beings show up and have compassion?
Right.
So often that fear gets coupled with worry for me.
Right.
And in that moment, as things moved forward, I knew that I could take a pause by breathing and acknowledge the fear that was rising up within me. And just that acknowledgement softened it,
Yeah.
transformed it. And I was able to be an advocate for myself and follow through with getting the services I needed.
Right. Thank you for sharing that experience, Ben. So her second focus is around the uses of our time. I'd like to use this platform here as an opportunity to talk about the four forms of rest. The four forms of rest are really about how do we live restfully within the activities of our lives,
Mhm.
right? First and foremost, are we present to the moment? Are we here? In many ways, the four forms of rest are around marshaling our resources so that we can be here. So the first one is, are we willing to have some period of time each day where we're quiet in meditation? Or if it's not meditation for you, it could be a walk in the woods. It could be qigong. It could be yoga. Whatever is going to help you get quiet, right? Quiet the mind. The second is each day take frequent breaks. I recommend a break every hour, where at some point or another you just take a little break. Need not be long, a few minutes is all you really need to just stand up away from whatever you're doing and just go off, have a cup of water, walk around the house, walk around the business place, whatever works for you. If the only place you can go is go sit on the toilet, then go sit on the toilet to get some quiet. There's not a right way to do it. There's just a necessity to do it and
It's
taking
true.
frequent breaks. And what people have found is that by taking frequent breaks throughout the day, they're much more effective because they're much better rested throughout their day. The third is how to create within each person's day some significant period, an hour to 2 hours, where you do nothing, where life has no purpose other than just to relax and enjoy. It could be sit on a porch, it could be the watching of a movie or a TV show, or multiple episodes of a TV show. Like, life need not have any other purpose other than just to be at ease and be entertained. And I think an hour or two is probably the bare minimum. I think most human beings don't get enough of that, of just not doing. And then lastly, sleep, which is, in large measure, what I observe in my clinical practice and in my work as a teacher is that the vast majority of humanity simply doesn't get enough rest, enough sleeping rest. Now, when I say sleep, I'm less concerned for a lot of people whether or not they're actually sleeping. I'm more concerned that if you're not sleeping, stay in bed, relax. If you need, read something or listen to something. You need not, have to be sleeping the entire sleep cycle. What really matters is you don't get up in the middle of the night and start working on something and disrupt that resting cycle, right? Because there's value in just laying there. And if your thoughts turn to anxious or worried thoughts, then listen to something, right? Or in some instances, maybe you get up and you take a shower. But those are not primary, I would suggest. The idea is to just allow yourself and train your body to be in bed for 7, 8, 9 hours each evening.
The next key that Eleanor presents is the difficult art of maturity. I feel like it's curious that she uses the word difficult. She acknowledges. She's not saying, hey, it's going to be hard and you have to persevere. She acknowledges the edge that
Mm-hmm.
is that difficulty. It's going to feel that way, but that doesn't encompass everything. And to me, that's the key. The difficulty doesn't drive the bus. And to keep playing with analogies in this sense for a moment, maturity equals a greater and greater depth of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're dipping your toes in the shallow end of the pool, and there comes a point in life where you're in the deep end, and then the pool itself is completely gone and you're in the depth of your own wisdom. You're in that ocean of wisdom. That self-belief is maturity and realizing the responsibility you have to yourself and sharing that with others and finding those moments that may feel difficult is an encouragement of stepping deeper and deeper into that wisdom, into that maturity. Those edges are inherently the softening.
Right. And what you're really pointing at as well is this opportunity in the process of learning the art of adulting is to make choices and be accountable to them.
Yes.
So what you're describing is wisdom is in many ways learning from what we all do, which is we all make mistakes. The question is how do we hold that notion of mistake, right? So the
Hmm.
difficult art of maturity on some level is making mistakes and being wise enough to learn from those mistakes, being present enough to our lives so that we don't keep repeating the same mistakes.
Mistakes can be seen as such a black and white thing, right?
Right.
A mistake falls on this one side.
Instead of learning how to be okay with our own imperfections. That was a big one for me in my early stages and throughout my adult life is being okay with the many mistakes that I've made. And, through the lens of being now 64, is the recognition of how much I gleaned from them. Much of it primarily later in life because that was when I started to really learn from a lot of my earlier mistakes, right? But it doesn't have to be later in life. I look at my own children and realize and recognize in them a level of maturity that was unknown to me at those early stages. They have a level of emotional maturity, fortunately, that allows them to make mistakes and learn from them. The next is within the context of what we're talking about, and Eleanor titles it as Readjustment is Endless. What she's really talking about is the acknowledgement that the world is always changing.
Mm.
And I think it's simultaneously the simplest of understandings and maybe one of the hardest for we as human beings to acknowledge. Because people are always grasping for the thing they can count on. And while there are human beings or there's elements of life that we can count on, that we can be grounded in, but the truth is, those are always changing. They're always evolving. And what she's saying there in the idea of readjustment, I love that. Like, we don't have to necessarily go off in another direction, but we do need to be constantly aware of the need to adjust to changing circumstance.
So it gets back to four forms of rest.
Yep. Having
Even
the resources,
having
right?
the resources, or even the pause that I chose as I entered into a process that I wasn't going to have complete control over,
Right.
as the phone call was starting and as the fear rose in me, but I still was able to pause and take that breath and readjust.
Right. Exactly.
So the next key that Eleanor presents is learning to be useful. And so much of what we've talked about her life is this advocate for others.
Hmm.
It can be articulated in so many different ways, but the key that we're offering here is finding within ourselves our calling, our own language. There's that adjustment of listening to oneself. And through that listening, through that sense of soulfulness, a calling starts to take shape. Or maybe it's already there. Maybe you're even already doing it. And, for me in that case, it's believing in myself in a way that actually reflects how so many other people see me day to day. And for Eleanor, so much of it was service for others. That may not always be the case
Hmm.
in one's calling, but there's going to be times where that happens, right? Where you're going to be a leader, where you're going to be able to advocate for someone. You're going to be able to support them in some way and show compassion.
Right.
But it doesn't always have to be a one immediate thing. I think a really good example is your relationship to the land here at
Hmm.
Simplicity. You learn to be useful
Hmm.
in ways here that you probably had never expected.
Right. So it's an interesting balancing act in
Mm,
the notion of being a what Eleanor's referring to as being useful, learning to be useful. So like there's what we're called to do, right? There's what the other could be, our work lives, our families, and it's meeting that call from the other, from outside of us, but meeting it in a way that feels authentic and true to us, right?
yeah.
And in my case, it was learning how to be a steward of the land, less about ownership and more about care. What does the land need?
Mm-hmm.
How do I balance out how to be a carer of this place so that it can thrive? It's that simple. And the same applies, I think, in being useful with whoever, right? So sometimes our work in being useful is meeting the need, and sometimes it's, drawing on that notion of how can we help others to help themselves, right? That's another version of being useful and not necessarily always stepping in and doing it for them,
That
right?
encouragement and that reminding someone that you value them.
So many of the people that I mentor in my work, so often they talk about the balancing act within their leadership roles and learning how to work with the people in their work environment or family environment in a way that they learn they're seeking to help them be better at whatever it is in their lives they're seeking to be better at, right? While better might be the enemy of perfection, better is how we heal and grow. Eleanor's next key fits really well in with our what we're talking about right now. And so in some ways we've already in essence answered. Eleanor's next key is the right to be an individual. I think she's speaking to that notion of that deeply American notion of being an individual. But that's only one facet of it, right? I think the other facet she's talking about is being an individual carries a certain level of responsibility in learning to cultivate and learning to trust our own inner voice and not just as we're often seeing in the world today through, a kind of version of individualism, is doing what I want because I wanna, rather than tapping into one's inner wisdom in such a way that it recognizes the reverberation of our choices, our actions, and that we're all connected, and that a responsibility comes within that interconnected thread that is human and life itself, right? Not just human existence, but all living things, right?
Eleanor's next key she phrases as how to get the best out of people. I think it's worth noting that in this moment in time, that kind of phrasing probably sounds different than what she meant in 1960, where the,
No
the
doubt.
golden rule was such a cultural touchstone, right?
Right. And just for bear repeating, tell people what the golden rule is.
The very basic. approach to the golden rule is treat others the way that you would want to be treated.
Amen.
It's so simple, it's so soft and kind.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, what she's really touching upon when she says how to get the best out of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's collaboration, it's deep listening, it's co-leading,
Right.
it's resonance.
Right. And each of those words or phrases, collaboration, deep listening, and co-leading, they all carry one key element, which is there's a consideration of others. So in bringing out the best in them, what in many ways what Eleanor is saying is, how can I work with you effectively so that our mission, our relationship is enhanced, it grows, right?
Mhm.
Is something growing here, or are we not bringing the best out in the world around us, right? Which, again, we see quite a bit in our world today, right? That tragic consequence of narcissism,
We've talked about the next one a little bit as well.
which is, as Eleanor put it, facing responsibility. So that word responsibility throughout my life has sort of carried a heavy weight because it was so attached to a wounded place in my childhood around needing to do what my parents saw as the right thing and having very little space for what that right thing might look like for me,
Mm,
right? Or for anyone else. And so I had to really learn how to face responsibility without allowing anxiety, worry, and frustration run the show around it. And that was a lot of my younger years were sort of like, what are the cons what's the responsibility? And so one of my anxiety responses and worry responses and frustration responses was to avoid.
mhm,
So I was the kid with the big project for school on Sunday night at 9 o'clock, finally getting around to the project because I had avoided the responsibility, right? That I had accepted. And in many instances, once I got into it, I enjoyed it, but I had avoided it so long because it weighed on me and I just kind of pushed it every other way, but it was still weighing on me, right? And it took me many years into my adult life before I began to learn to treat responsibility as a creative endeavor, as a creative opportunity, as a form, on some level, of play, of experimentation, that getting it right wasn't the lens through which I was going to find any level of enjoyment out of the process. Everything became, from the through the lens of responsibility, became a form of dread, right? And now I'm able, in large measure, to enjoy my responsibilities because I'm not putting them off to the last second. Frankly, today is a great example, right? We're recording the podcast, the second part, before we even have released the first part,
right.
right?
This notion of getting it right, it's just not going to happen all the time. And
Right.
defining what's right for us, as you've been talking about, then changes over time,
Yeah.
to go back to that notion.
Right. So my practice in meditation, Tao Yin specifically, and my practice in journaling allows me to be in touch with the things that I'm feeling so that when those feelings come up, which they haven't disappeared, I just have a practice with them so that they don't run my life.
Yeah, the dread isn't there so much.
No, no, it doesn't get to that point. There's things that unexpectedly happen that, back to we have to readjust, right?
Hmm.
But it doesn't lead me to dread.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt's next key, I mean, it's all encompassing in terms of how to go about it. There's so many different
Right,
ways to
right.
approach it.
Yeah.
She states it as essentially a question. How can everyone take part in politics? So there's something that we had written down when we were looking at these keys that's quite interesting. as it pertains to the United States and this idea of voting, right? The act of voting, it's an
Hmm.
action.
Right.
And we got to talking about it and wondering how to bring her key into where we're at. So, the act of voting is not necessarily about do you want to become political? Like so many people create a barrier there, talk about a
Hmm.
barrier of
I'm
fear.
not a political person. I'm not into politics.
Yeah.
There's an inherent distrust, I would suggest, at this juncture. Without realizing on a certain level, I would offer that whether we want to acknowledge or not, all social interaction has a political element. If we can acknowledge that part, then we don't have to separate out politics from our social being. You know, I know what the truth is here. You need to hear my truth and you need to agree with my truth, right? Because that's the big thing missing in our discourse, right? We're so
Mhm.
unpracticed in the art of disagreement that everything breaks down
Immediately.
immediately.
There's the line is already drawn. The idea of winning and losing
Hmm.
is so prominent in people's minds rather than this sense of what kind of world do you want to help create? What kinds of values do
Amen.
you have that you can bring in to a place of co-creation, right?
Right,
Cooperation.
right.
And
Beautifully
know that
said.
there's going to be discourse there. Know that there's going to be arguments there. That's okay.
Hmm.
That's
Right.
probably better that there are those things because what do? We learn from our mistakes, right? We take responsibility. All of the things that Eleanor was talking about does end up here in how to be political, like you said. Every social interaction,
Hmm.
every form of art, it has that element.
It does. And on a certain level, if we're really listening to another, whether we're talking about politics or not, we kind of know in their speaking where their heart lies, regardless of their political beliefs. And I have to admit that there are times when I am put off by people who don't seem to care
Hmm.
about the impact of their words or actions. And then I realize, okay, what version of anxiety, worry, or frustration or deep sadness is really at play here? That doesn't necessarily always make it okay, but at least it allows me not to be in a state of conflict with that individual.
Yeah, everything softens. The notion of where their heart is comes into focus.
Right, that
And
there's pain there.
yeah.
That there's pain there when I see that kind of conflict within them, that they can't see another's perspective. And it kind of goes along with the next key, which is, learning to be a public servant. And I would suggest that in today's world is, in essence, whatever you want it to be. That for some people, it's about the little things. So they want to volunteer to do this, or they want to, there's some, what they would call some small engagement. And I would suggest that there's no engagement too small. And then there's other people who do what we do, right?
Mhm.
They choose something that's sustaining. And for 2 years now, we've been doing this thing where we're focusing on healing and growth. And how do we bring healing and growth into the larger conversations, right? How do we bring healing and growth into as a consideration into everything in our lives, right? Rather than separating it out. Oh, that's about health or that's about spirituality. Well, if we take these elements out of our being, out of our lives, then we've separated ourselves. And we're saying, oh, we can't talk about healing and growth as it pertains to politics because it's not what it's about. Well, why not? Why isn't it about it? And that's what our conversation here is about over these last 2 years. How do we bring the possibility of healing and growth into, in essence, every conversation? And that, for us, is being a public servant. And it reaches who it reaches.
So Eleanor Roosevelt's 11 keys evolved over her lifetime, and she shared them in her book in 1960. This was past this incredible era of change for the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through the New Deal
Mm-hmm.
that her husband, the President Franklin D. Roosevelt, shepherded. through World War II, through all of her advocacy for people with disabilities and mental illnesses. It's very important to ground ourselves in this notion of what the New Deal really did. There are the critics out there that say, well, so much of it was chopped up and taken out. Roosevelt also really knew how much the American people were wanting real, necessary change to adjust to the world around them.
Mm-hmm.
We are at another one of those moments.
Right. Right. We are.
The support needed to meet moments of hardship now look different than in the 1930s in some respects, but from an emotional and spiritual space, you could say that we as a culture, as a society, are learning that have made a mistake and that we need to re-engage with our responsibility and our maturity.
Mm-hmm.
We had a moment to mature then. We had a moment to change our society for the better.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't met in all the ways that it needed to be.
Right.
So we're emphasizing this through a so-called new mental health deal, right? If we're
Right.
going to use that phrasing.
Yeah.
To learn to work together, to support those most in need, and to recognize that we all have shared needs, I think is
Right.
another important aspect of this.
Absolutely.
And right now, there is a very apparent mental health crisis that is affecting every segment of our society.
Right.
No one is immune to this growing social dystopia that we are living in.
Right.
It's unfolding at a very rapid pace, and our human bodies, our spirits, are discombobulated because of it.
Right.
It's coming so ferociously. So we make no claim, right, to have steadfast answers,
Right.
but rather we want to acknowledge this crisis that we can collectively dedicate real resources, sustainable resources.
And to acknowledge that where we're speaking from is from a place of healing and growth,
Mm-hmm.
from a support of the spirit of being better at being human. Each of us individually, each of us as beings that we came onto this planet to heal, we came to this planet to grow. And here are some ways from our perspective that we can do this better. And I think sometimes in the intermix of everything, some of this gets lost, right? And when you speak of self-responsibility, it might surprise people, right? Because we're, you know, very progressive in our orientation.
Sure.
And yet progressivism isn't about not taking responsibility. It's taking a perspective that acknowledges that we're all in this together and that we share responsibility. So we want to begin with the first point, which is frankly acknowledging that we need to let go of behavior modification through pharmacology, through drugs, as the only approach, the primary approach to treating mental health issues. Does it have a role? Yes. Does it have a role to the degree to which, medicines are being dispensed like candy without any kind of holistic kind of foundation, like real foundation in other elements of what it means to care for ourselves and to be cared for by others? No. The mental health crisis we face means acknowledging that the social media as a point of interconnection has failed us. That it can't be the way that we approach this. That we can't just take a pill and keep on doing things the way we're doing and expect another result. It's failed us, and those suffering as a result from how social media has kind of taken over their devices, or as Rory put it as he played Gollum, we can't treat devices as the most important thing in our lives. Our precious, right?
Yeah.
And that's how most human beings behaviorally are acting, as if their devices are the most important thing in their lives. And then what's on those devices, what's occupying their minds, needs to be adjusted.
And everyone knows this. I want to add, everyone knows this at an inherent level.
Yep.
It's, do we have the time to rest? Do we have the self-reflection to do this? I mean,
Right.
yesterday there was that story when you turned on the radio that I overheard on NPR, and they were talking about these listening parties that were happening at
Mm-hmm.
bars, right? You
Right.
went and you
Yeah,
got
yeah.
yourself a drink or some food, and you went to the listening room
Yeah.
and you listened to a whole album.
And you
And
sat in silence
that's
and
right.
you listened to this entire album with these amazing sound system inside this room. It's so, is it for everyone? No, but it's a way to kind of just let go into like beautiful sound and just be,
Just
right?
be.
Just be.
So much of this is about being. I
Yeah.
think that's what we're going to get into here. The next point that we wanted to offer, it touches upon everything that we've come to in this way, and it's very potent. Acknowledging that the patterns of emotional pain that we experience begins very early in our lives,
Hmm.
right? How we learn to do life. We've
Right.
we've we've talked about that and used those words before. How we learn to do it gets imprinted on us through our parents or other
Yeah.
guardians, family members over time. It's not only an act of thinking. I think this is really key to distinguish. It's not just I think this is the way. On a cellular level, you feel that that's the way. That's the way that your
Hmm.
perspective on reality is actually shaped.
Right.
So unwinding these patterns becomes the fodder for our mental health throughout our life, right?
Right.
it, Talk about being responsible for ourselves and showing up for others too
Hmm.
in that and being vulnerable with others. I know that that is very important to when I'm feeling dread. You
Hmm.
mentioned earlier. I
Yeah.
still feel that dread, especially in relation to like work responsibility. But often when I meditate, when I journal, and when I share my feelings and thoughts with someone else, and they share their experience of it, it transforms.
Right.
So it's not just an unwinding, it's a transformational, it's an intentional transformation that we can get better and better and better at. It
Right.
doesn't have to be something that we kind of bump into along the way.
And acknowledging, as you're pointing out so astutely, that it's how we do the journey rather than the destination
Hmm.
that's really going to unwind those imprinted patterns from childhood. Our parents teach us how, through their way of being anxious, worried, or frustrated, or deeply sad, their way of doing life, and we have to become very present to how that has landed in us so that we can do it a little different, do it better than we were taught to do it, right?
Yeah.
And, we talk about the impact of generational trauma and wounding,
Mm.
but there's untold. Every human being is on some level impacted by how this imprinting occurs and how we really need to unwind that so that this doesn't continue to pass down. And so, to make this next point truly impactful in the way it is, we need to do the step that we just talked about, unwinding these patterns we learned, so that we can bring our inner resources as well as our outer resources together so that we can serve, we can connect, and create community as a primary focus. And that recognizing that that focus needs to be on localized resources so that communities feel connected, invested in a process. Our local communities throughout the country, with many exceptions, but for the most part, local community is suffering. You look at no further than the county I live in, Prince George's County, that's predominantly Democrat. It's rare that a Republican ever gets voted into anything in Prince George's County, which means that the primary is everything. 18% of registered voters voted just a few weeks ago. 18%. It's a message. People don't feel connected to their communities and don't feel as if their vote matters. This is what needs and why this needs such great investment. We need to bring resources together so that service, connection, and community are the primary focus. A focus on localizing resources so that communities feel connected, invested, so that service by as well as for those with disabilities can feel truly as if everyone is within a localized fabric, right?
Hmm.
And empower those with challenges to be engaged as part of their own solution and not victims of accident or genetics. And this is not an acknowledgement of some right wing notion that those with mental health challenges are somehow lazy. The opposite. This is a way to bring an acceptance of the importance of interconnection and service where it's needed, which is into creating healthy community.
So that's again, it goes back to how are we being responsible as an individual so that we can participate in
Mm-hmm.
co-creation.
Right.
And we've talked about the place that pharmacology and that studies in behavior have, that there can be a pathway. But what feels to be really missing in terms of access for everyone are holistic practices. They need to be brought to the forefront. A way to break down an understanding of these practices is, well, through a better understanding of them in the lens that we talk about, right? Healing and growth. So, as we state a lot on the podcast, we have to acknowledge that one without the other is inherently incomplete. And healing modalities such as acupuncture are best complemented then with tools and resources for cultivating growth and self-reflection.
Right.
You go in and you get acupuncture, and your body is healing in these ways. It's opening up, and
Mm-hmm.
it's calling for that growth then to
It
be
is.
focused into.
Right.
And that could be through meditation or Yin practices.
Or whatever it might be. Acupuncture opens us up to that doorway, but then
Hmm.
we have to choose
We have to choose.
to walk into the door and continue to grow who we are as human beings, right?
Yeah, so it is a practice in presence, how we
Right.
choose to be present.
Right. Bringing some time and energy into that, right? Recognizing that there's a mix of resources that meets that human being. I'm a deeply spiritual man who's not in any way connected to organized religion, right? I have a deep reverence for Yeshua ben Joseph, but I don't have a religious practice. I have a deeply spiritual practice, right? Which is a discernment between someone who might walk into my work with a very religious approach. So with them, I'm likely to say there's nothing wrong with a scriptural reading to go along with your meditation and your journaling, right?
Hmm.
For
Hmm.
them, that works, right? Not necessarily something I feel compelled to do. And so it's about meeting people where they are and acknowledging that all of the resources that have been created over the last, several thousand years of human existence don't need us to reinvent the wheel. We don't need novelty. And I think it's key to recognize this false notion that every time we hear about, some new way of doing holistics, whatever it is, it's not new. It's repackaged, it's renamed, but it's really the same thing, and on some level, reconceived from its ancient root. And there's nothing per se wrong with that, except for when that package then becomes something that large corporations and large entities then start to use as a profit center
Hmm.
rather than as a way to help people. And I think that's the danger that we face in our world right now with healthcare and with mental health care and with healing and growth is avoiding the trap of turning these into new profit centers, right? I'm not saying people don't need or deserve to earn a good living, but they need not be run by corporate entities. Let's keep this local.
So it starts locally, and then the other component, if we're kind of to weigh healing and growth, local and universal, right?
Right. Bam. Local and universal.
An innovation that's proposed as, oh my God, it's going to be inequitable, and its implementation, there's going to be so many things that's just an excuse
Right.
made by for-profit entities,
Right.
basically saying we are the ones that suffer through that.
Right.
They turn an entity, a corporation, which is not a person, even though legally it says that it is, into this form of victimhood, which is frankly ridiculous. The irony there
Ridiculous.
is just
Right.
off the charts. So, one way to see our political and social climate is in recognizing that the toxicity of our world, the way that a corporation will respond as if it's a victim, it can't find resolution without a care system that is available to all. It starts locally. And then once we understand where we're at with our neighbors, with our city council, with our county representatives, with the businesses that are local, then it starts to become a question of what's universal.
Hmm.
And we know that universal health care is a key. It is not impossible. It's just simply stated as impossible by for-profit entities. It is a lie, essentially.
And a lie that's so absurd because universal health care is available in many nations around the world at significantly lower costs than available here in the United States. Good care at a very reasonable cost compared to what we have here. So we'd like to finish up by, in essence, acknowledging something that I think humanity has forgotten and
Mm,
continues to forget over and over again, which is we are part, not the primary part, but just simply a part of a planet. The planet wasn't created so that humanity could use up all of its resources, toxify it, and then, in essence, try to leave it. We've made our bed. We're going to have to create a very, very different relationship with the natural world. And we begin by acknowledging that we're only a part of it, and we become a part of it by connecting our hearts, our minds, our spirits with the beings that make up the natural world. So, time and nature, it's that simple. And there's a lot of human beings that see ourselves as, oh, well, we're the overseers of the natural
mm,
world. I don't think it's working so well. We're the overseers. And if we continue to see the world as simply resources to be used instead of something to be tended
mhm,
to be stewarded so that
mhm,
it was sustainable. And a very simple formula that I often use in my own mind is what is a choice that I'm making today? How will it impact the children's children's children? Right? It's very simple because if it's going to have a negative impact on 4 generations down of children, it's going to have a huge impact on the living creatures other than human that exist in the world. And it's time for us to acknowledge it and reconceive the notion of what economic growth is. I don't know what that formula looks like. It's not my strength. I'm not an economist. But as we've explored over and over again, it can't continue this way and be sustainable. And for those of you who are, oh, I'd like to get outside, but it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too humid, it's too wet, it's too buggy, it's too something. This is your chance to get out of your own way and let go into your breath, into your senses. Feel the natural world around you and let it have its way with you. When we do that, something intrinsically changes in us as human beings. I remember many, many years ago, there was a series of essays written exclusively by Native American authors that was titled, I Become Part of It. They're in essence talking about how we become a part of the world around us in a multitude of ways. But
yeah.
that's what we're talking about, becoming part of it. And recognizing that it's not there for our whims and our consumption, but it's there because we're a part of it. And at this juncture, that must change.
It must change. If any of these things that we've shared today have a focal point, a starting point,
Yeah,
it's that.
yeah, absolutely.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.